This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging market stocks fell today, set for their worst week in 4 months as a surge in COVID-19 cases, as well as doubts over the rollout of vaccine programs, helped to dent risk appetite. MSCI's index of emerging market stocks dropped 0.7% on the day. It was set to shed nearly 3.8% this week. However, the index was also still poised to notch a monthly gain. Meanwhile, South Africa's main stock index also poised to halt a 4-week rally that saw it post 8 record closes since the start of the year. It is looking at its first weekly drop of 2021 as weakness in miners and banks overwhelmed gains in index heavyweights Naspers and Sasol. Also coming up on the show today, Kenya slides into recession for the first time in 2 decades. A Dutch court orders Shell Nigeria to compensate farmers for oil spills. And the U.S. economy shrunk by 3.5% in 2020. Well, let's start off tonight's show in Kenya. The economy, for the first time in 20 years, slid into a recession in the third quarter of 2020, and that's due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the National Statistics Bureau says that the GDP in East Africa's biggest economy fell by 1.1% during the quarter July through September. Now, Kenya confirmed its first coronavirus infection in mid-March and later imposed a partial lockdown. Shutdowns in key markets such as the European Union and the UK hit the country's main foreign income earners. They include tourism and exports of tea, as well as flowers, fruit and vegetables. Now, according to data from Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, agriculture, which makes up a third of Kenya's GDP, grew by 6.3%. And that is compared with a 7.3% expansion in the April to June period. That was helped by tea production, which increased 14% in the quarter, and that thanks to favorable weather. Now, the World Bank sees Kenya's economy rebounding to growth of 6.9% in 2021 from an estimated 1% contraction last year. And let's move on now. The International Monetary Fund says government debt around the world shot up last year to approach levels last seen in the aftermath of World War II. That is as nations stepped up spending to fight the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic fallout. Now, according to the Washington-based lender, public debt as a share of global GDP surged to 98% by the end of December, and that's from 84% at the end of 2019, before, of course, the pandemic struck. The total dollar value of global debt, which includes central and state government debt, rose to $89.6 trillion at the year's end. The increase was particularly large amongst advanced economies, which can easily borrow at low interest rates. The debt-to-GDP ratio amongst those nations rose to 123% by December from 105% in 2019, and it is expected to grow to 125% this year. Now, elsewhere, South Africa may be forced to revise its tax increase targets as its budget shortfall is set to breach wartime levels for a second consecutive year. According to estimates, the budget deficit will reach 11% of GDP in the fiscal year through March 2022, and that compares with the government's estimate of 10.1% published in last October's medium-term budget policy statement. CGTN's Angelo Coppola has more from Johannesburg.
According to a recently released survey, the budget deficit will reach 11% of gross domestic product in the fiscal year to end March 2022.
There are still investors out there that look at South Africa with interest. So we're still getting, investors in our bond market. And what I'm concerned is that government once again will have the ability to kick the ball a little bit further down the road. But the problem with a budget deficit like the one that we're having, and the one and one that is growing at the rate that we are seeing, is that we will be at a fiscal cliff very soon, and it will catch us unawares if we do not do something about it.
Others are concerned about the interest rate costs on debt repayments.
As the debt pile goes up as a percentage of our GDP, it's also going to mean further rating downgrades. And that's what brings the second thing into play. We're going to see higher and higher interest rates.
The question on everyone's minds is, what will the government do?
We are really hoping to see that government will cut back on their expenditure quite dramatically. But it's unlikely that that would be something that we would see. It might be a slower process than what we actually need. We might get private sector getting involved, out of their own regard and trying to fix the economy, to try and create an environment where business can grow.
I think they are going to try and cut spending and reprioritize it. I think the second thing that they're going to do is look at ways that they can collect more taxes, whether that is looking for more rich people that they think are circumventing the thing, or whether it's increasing taxes.
Government will be looking very closely at a broad spectrum of taxes to attempt to narrow that gap.
We are expecting that they will be increasing taxes in some areas. We don't think, for example, an area such as VAT would be on their agenda. They would rather look at taxes that focus on the richer part of the population, which, to be quite honest, is actually middle class and upper middle class. So we expect to see a couple of new taxes there.
The South African government knows what it needs to do to reduce that budget deficit, but the question is whether it has the political will or not to do what needs to be done. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's now turn back to our top story today. Kenya's economy plunged into its first recession in 20 years in the third quarter of 2020. Let's delve further into the country's economic outlook. We're joined by Joy Kirumweni. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi School of Economics. Great to have you on the show with us, Joy. Now, interesting to note, despite the contraction in GDP in the second and third quarter of 2020, there is still some debate here in Kenya as to whether the economy is in recession, especially given the fact that the CBK is saying economic indicators point to a recovery in the fourth quarter of 2020. So what's your take on this? Is Kenya's economy in recession?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your question. The thing is, let me speak from an expert point of view. If you talk about a recession, there's a very clear definition of what a recession is. And a recession is a persistent drop in GDP, which is also accompanied by a drop in prices, mass unemployment, fall in interest rates, and generally high levels of poverty. That's what a recession is. Clearly, if you look at the situation in Kenya, yes, the economy has been bruised, but what you're experiencing is an economic shock, which, if all the right policies are put in place, is likely to be transient, or rather it's likely not to be permanent. Rather, we expect it to recover. If you look at what is causing this economic shock or this economic, the GDP for Kenya has just gone down, just like many other countries have. It's not like it's a unique situation for Kenya alone. If you look at what is causing all this economic shock, it's simply a health crisis that has had immense economic impacts. So, if we are going to be dealing with the economic impacts of the crisis, then we have to manage issues of social distancing and also issues of people being unable to carry on with their economic lives. And that is happening. If you look at the restrictions which were happening before, some of them are easing, and we don't expect major ones so far. So the point is, yes, the economy received a shock, just like many other economies, but Kenya is coming out stronger.
Well,
it's not a recession, rather, it's an economic shock. And with the right, of course, if it's not well managed, it could turn out to be a recession, if it is not well managed. But so far, the economic policies which have been put in place seem to be working to push on the economy.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but let's turn to what the Central Bank of Kenya has said. It says it is optimistic about early signs of an economic rebound, but it is also warning of a much tougher forecast this year, especially given the effects of a second wave of COVID-19 cases globally. And of course, the fact that Kenya has lost a number of its shock absorbers. We've got those debt numbers as well. So given all these factors, is a rebound in the economy uncertain at this stage?
Let's talk the facts. Initially, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were forecasting an economic slowdown of negative 1.5%. Eventually, the economics shrunk by about 1%, by up to 1% economic shrinking, for example. And what you're saying now, in the year 2021, we're expecting an economic rebound of about 5.2 to 6.9, depending. There are conditions for that. One of them is a recovery of a vaccine, meaning that we might be expecting a full recovery of the tourism sector. And the other one is the reopening of schools. If you look at the second wave of the pandemic, one of the things that has happened is that the hospitalization levels are still much lower than earlier predicted. If there are lots of people who have the COVID antibodies and they don't remember ever falling sick, meaning that yes, the second wave is highly infectious. It's affecting many, many people, but it also has less worse effects in terms of the economic impact on individual Kenyans. So the point is, yes, schools have reopened. We hope they will remain open, subject to how the second wave of the pandemic continues to manifest itself. And secondly, of course, you know that there are the challenges of the vaccine.
Well, it looks like Well, it looks like we lost Joy Mweni there. She was a senior lecturer at University of Nairobi School of Economics. She was discussing Kenya's economic outlook. We'll certainly try to get her back later. Well, let's shift focus now. Take a look at our corporate headlines today. Now, East African Breweries is banking on e-commerce and off-trade to drive its sales this year. That's after recovering from a tough first half of 2020. The regional beer and spirits maker recorded a net sales decline of 3% to roughly $404 million for the half year ending December 2020, and that is compared to the same period last year. The company's net sales in Kenya dropped by 10% in the period under review. The drop was influenced by COVID-19 restrictions. Net sales in Tanzania and Uganda jumped 17% and 13% respectively. Meanwhile, Toyota Motor Corporation overtook Volkswagen AG in 2020 to become the world's top-selling automaker. It is the first time the Japanese giant has clinched the position in 5 years. Now, Toyota's group sales this year were 9.53 million units. That's compared with VW's 9.31 million announced earlier this month. The victory for Toyota came despite a decline in global sales of more than 10% as the auto industry suffered the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Meanwhile, Chemicals and Energy Group Sasol says it is set for a stronger 2021 half-year earnings, and that's thanks to cost containment measures that helped it weather the impact of hurricanes and lower oil prices. The petrochemicals firm expects earnings per share to rise by more than 100%, and that is compared to the previous half year. The 2020 financial year saw Sasol posting a $6 billion loss, an impairment to the tune of $7.4 billion. Sasol is set to release its 2021 interim financial results on the 22nd of February. And finally, American Airlines has posted a $8.9 billion annual loss, its biggest on record, as travel restrictions and lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged air travel in 2020. Now, despite reducing its operating spending by $7 billion in 2020, mainly by cancelling numerous flights, the airline continued to burn about $30 million a day in the fourth quarter. This, of course, resulted in a net loss of $2.2 billion over the period as its revenues collapsed by 64%. American Airlines ended the fourth quarter with about $14.3 billion in available liquidity. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, we are heading into a short break now, still coming up on the show. A Dutch court orders Shell Nigeria to compensate farmers for oil spills. And African leaders push for wide access to COVID-19 vaccines at the Davos Leaders Virtual Forum.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Now, the Court of Appeal in The Hague has ordered the Nigerian subsidiary of Shell to pay compensation over oil spills in Nigeria's Niger Delta region. The Nigerian arm of the British-Dutch company is to issue payouts over a long-running civil case involving 4 Nigerian farmers seeking compensation and a cleanup from the company over pollution caused by leaking oil pipelines. The court did not hold Shell's parent company directly responsible, but it did order it to install a leak detection system on the Oruma pipeline, the site of a significant number of those spills in the case. The spills concerned were between 2004 and 2007, but pollution from leaking oil pipelines remains a major problem in the Niger Delta region. The ruling could pave the way for more cases against the multinational oil firm going forward. Meanwhile, like every other economy across the world, Nigeria is also facing one of its hardest times in decades. A plunge in oil revenue and the COVID-19-induced slowdown combined to throw Africa's largest economy into recession late last year. But despite these challenges, policymakers say the outlook for 2021 looks promising and that the recession will be short-lived. CGTN's Deji Badmus has more on that story.
If current trends are anything to go by, the horizon doesn't look bright for Africa's biggest economy. Nigeria is in a recession and battling a second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Inflation is at a 3-year high of 15.8%. The local currency is still far from stable, while forex still remains scarce. The country's external account is weak and government's revenues are depleting. Despite the seeming grim picture, experts and managers of the economy are optimistic things will turn around.
The medium-term outlook for both the domestic and global economies continue to show improved prospects of recovery, supported by the recent moderate uptick in crude prices and increased optimism over the procurement and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Available data and forecasts for key macroeconomic variables for the Nigerian economy suggest further improvement in output growth in the first quarter of 2021.
Experts say oil still remains very crucial to Nigeria's recovery and growth. Global oil prices have been stable for quite some time now, and despite OPEC production cuts, the country is compensating for its own share of the cuts with condensate.
This economy requires massive amounts of investment. We will achieve that investment if we are able to get macroeconomic stability. We need a set of policies that are internally coherent and consistent, which enable us to bring down inflation and accelerate growth.
Inflation is indeed a big headache for Nigeria. The gap between inflation and interest rate has continued to widen. Experts believe closing that gap is a priority, and the country's central bank says it is committed to doing so.
We will continue our price and monetary stability mandate, but that must be conducive to growth, because you need to see positive growth in our economy as well as inflation. They must come together. We'll be looking aggressively at what can we do to put in place measures that will stimulate consumer spending, that will ultimately also lead to more facilities for manufacturing companies to agri companies, so that this will help to create employment, stimulate manufacturing output, and positively impact on our GDP.
The central bank has been injecting massive funds into the economy to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on the country. It so far disbursed 2 trillion naira as stimulus to keep the economy running, and it says it is willing to spend more to ensure Nigeria exits recession as soon as the end of the current quarter.
2021 promises to be a better year than 2020. The challenges that we face at the macro level will continue to evolve. The challenges that businesses will face will also continue to evolve. But I am clear in my mind that there are significant opportunities that corporates can and must respond to if they are going to grow.
The country appears to be on the track to recovery, but growth will be a very slow process. Badmus, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Now, as a global rush for COVID-19 vaccines continues, there are fears that African nations could be left badly exposed if richer and more developed nations hoard those vaccines. Now, African nations are banking on a global discussion in Switzerland around the vaccine to change the dynamics of how the continent accesses the crucial jabs. Here's CGTN's Daniel Arab Moy with that report.
The hoarding of vaccines by rich countries has complicated Africa's efforts to secure enough supplies for its population. The price of not solving the vaccine distribution challenge internationally has left many African countries scrambling.
The developed North, which has substantial financial resources, has purchased the largest stocks, while we in Africa are struggling to get our fair share. The painful irony is that some of the clinical trials for these vaccines were carried out in Africa.
According to Duke University's Global Health Institute, rich countries have locked up 60% of the global vaccine supply. Rwandan President Paul Kagame has called for a review and adjustment of social protection systems to fill gaps that have been revealed by the COVID-19 crisis.
The social protection agenda cannot be limited to wealthy countries indeed. In fact, the pandemic has also reminded us of how we are interlinked and how we are interdependent in many ways, so that in one part of the globe, things happening will affect the other part as well. It doesn't matter how rich or how poor we are.
Calls for a people's vaccine seem to be falling on deaf ears as wealthier countries have it their way.
The promise of equitable access and distribution disparities of COVID-19 vaccines is feared will only prolong the pandemic unless the world join hands to defeat the deadly and yet invisible enemy.
In Africa, many people are still pinning their hopes on the arrival of the COVID-19 vaccines. This year's Davos Forum will play an important role in rebuilding trust and ensuring no one is left behind during the global pandemic. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
And let's move on now. Data from the Bank of Tanzania shows a massive decline in both volume and value of cleared checks over the last 6 years. This is as the banking sector adopts technological payment systems. The value of check transactions in the country has decreased by over 65% from $3.3 billion in 2014 to $1.1 billion in 2019. Here's CGTN's Isaac Lukando with more.
Technology is changing the way Tanzanians are making payments. Digital transactions are contributing to a decline in the number of check transactions in the country.
Check transactions, they are really declining. If you look at from once, just from the 3 years back, 2017 into 2020, you see like a 22% of the check transaction, both in value and volumes, they've actually declined quite significantly. And you see much of the transactions are migrating to electronic payments, and for the same period you can see a 21% increase.
The Tanzania Bankers Association says many banks are currently offering mobile banking, internet banking, as well as payments through points of sale, which have reduced the need for checks. It claims reduced costs brought about by digital transactions are benefiting banks and their customers. The decline of check transactions in Tanzania is reflective of a global trend. It's being fueled here partly by the growing use of mobile money. Figures from the Tanzania Communication Regulatory Authority show there are currently more than 30 million mobile money accounts in the country. More than 6 million were registered within just 1 year. And convenience appears to be driving the rise in mobile money transactions.
It's quite fast, it's instant. It takes lesser time. Seconds, you just do your transaction. But for check, it's a process. You have to go to find a bank. It has to be opening hours. Yeah, 3 days clearance to take. But if you send your money through your mobile phone, it's instant and very fast. The fund is on the other side.
Countries like South Africa and Namibia have already abolished payments via checks. The growing digital transactions could lead Tanzania down a similar path. Isaac Lukando, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a quick break now. Still to come. The U.S. economy shrinks by 3.5% in 2020. And farmers' protests over new laws in India intensify.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Just about 1:30, here's a recap of other headlines. Unknown assailants have attacked different parts of Nigeria, allegedly kidnapping at least 75 people and killing 18 others. Now, 50 of the victims were reportedly kidnapped in Niger State, while the other abductions occurred in neighboring states. Meanwhile, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has announced that the continent has secured the supply of 400 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines from India's Serum Institute. That is in addition to the 270 million doses of vaccines that African nations were already waiting for. And the presidency in the Democratic Republic of Congo now says Prime Minister Sylvester Ilunkamba has finally resigned. The resignation will now pave the way for President Felix Tshisekedi to rid his cabinet of his predecessor's allies. Now, Ilunga, an ally of former President Joseph Kabila, stepped down after Parliament passed a no-confidence motion on Wednesday. And that is a recap of today's top headlines. Well, let's get you some international news now. The U.S. economy shrank 3.5% last year, and that's despite a 4% rebound in the last quarter. It is the world's biggest economy's first contraction since the 2008 financial crisis. It is also its biggest drop in over 70 years, as CGTN's Charles Gibson now reports.
A long wait for a coronavirus vaccine in New York City, and it could be a while before the US economy gets a shot in the arm itself. New data shows a 3.5% contraction in 2020 and fourth quarter GDP growth at an annualized rate of 4%. That's way down on the explosive 33.4% growth between July and September, which was largely a rebound from a devastating COVID-fueled dip in the spring. Announcing interest rates will remain near zero on Wednesday, the chair of the Federal Reserve was clear about the number one challenge facing the economy.
What you see is an economy where what's holding it back is not the lack of policy support from the Fed, it's the pandemic. It's the spread of the disease and people's reluctance or inability to partake in certain kinds of economic activities, which amount to a meaningful part of the economy.
Surging coronavirus case numbers forced many businesses to close again over the winter before political upheaval in the wake of last November's US presidential election.
Here in the US Capitol, the mayor has asked businesses to take down these wooden boards that were put up due to fears over violence during the presidential inauguration, to show DC is open for business.
The International Monetary Fund, though, upgraded its forecast for both the US and the world this week, predicting 5.5% global growth and 5.1% for the US.
The upgrade is owing to positive effects that have come upon with the onset of vaccinations in many countries, and also because of the additional fiscal policy support that's been provided in some economies like the US and Japan.
Good afternoon, everybody.
US President Joe Biden wants to keep the taps open, asking Congress to approve a $1.9 trillion relief package as states roll out unprecedented vaccination programs. Giles Gibson for CGTN in Washington.
Well, let's head to India now. The country's Haryana state, which borders the capital New Delhi, blocked mobile internet across most of its districts on a Friday. Now, the communications blackout was imposed after new clashes broke out at a farmers' protest site. Thousands have joined their colleagues in the capital to reinforce demonstrations. Our correspondent Ravinder Bawa has more.
There are tempers which are running quite high as far as the protesters are concerned, and also the locals. Remember, these sites are on the borders of Delhi, where tens of thousands of farmers have been protesting for over 2 months. And what has happened is that the locals, after the Tuesday incident when a faction of farmers landed up at the Red Fort and there was violence on the streets of Delhi, there has been a turning of tables against the protesters. There has been a divide in the farmers groups, in the sense some of them say that this is disrespecting the national flag. Violence on the streets of Delhi is not a sign of protest, and that is why they now want these protesters to move out of these sites, because these people who have landed up and had clashes on the borders of Delhi today say that these protesters have been challenging their daily lives. Their livelihoods have been, shut. Their businesses have been shut. So they want them to vacate. But the authenticity of how many of these were locals and why they actually landed up in that place, despite heavy police deployment, heavy other security forces deployment, barricading, still they landed up. And those are the questions which are being raised. And the farmers claim that this skirmishes have been instigated by the police and the politicians, but the reality of it all is not known. But definitely a policeman was hurt today, and there was hurling of stones from both the sides. The police they had to use batons as well as tear gas shells to control the crowd. As of now, situation under control, but volatile.
Now, so far, Cambodia has escaped the worst of the coronavirus pandemic, but the country could soon be facing a debt crisis. Now, microfinancing may have lifted millions of people out of poverty, but COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerabilities of the country's system. Here's Dusita Sakeo reporting.
A lock on a door keeps you and your family safe. A lock on the other side of the door and your world suddenly becomes a scary place. House after house padlock front doors, houses abandoned by people who once called them home. They fled as debt collectors came knocking. They hide as debt becomes a widespread, increasingly chronic disease, infecting millions of Cambodians.
If you lived here, you will see how difficult it is for us. That house has been abandoned, and the house behind me was taken to pay back loans. If they keep asking for money, I might run away. Someone told me not to commit suicide, but I'm so stressed.
This padlocked home once belonged to Bangthe's daughter. Bangthe and her daughter are heavily in debt. She owes $10,000 to microfinance institutions. In order to pay that off, she borrowed from moneylenders. Like the majority of people in this village, she is now trapped under a mountain of crippling debt. It's easy to see how. Brochures advertising easy cash are everywhere, touting loans as a simple path to fulfilling their materialistic dreams. But in times of COVID-19, paying that off is anything but easy.
They have no job, they can't find work or income, so they run and hide. Houses are locked because of debt problems. Many cannot work as farmers since their land was used as collateral or sold.
Microfinance was supposed to relieve poverty by providing people with access to capital to start business and increase incomes. But somewhere along the way, things went wrong. Loan sizes skyrocketed to one of the highest in the world, $10 billion in outstanding microloans, more than 1/3 of the country's GDP. Throughout Cambodia, widespread microfinance debt have pushed people to seek work across the border, which is not far from here. But as Thailand sealed off its border to control the COVID-19 pandemic, it is estimated that more than 80,000 Cambodians have returned home, the majority faced with a sudden loss of income, unable to pay back loans. Persistent debt collectors will still go knocking, and the answers will remain the same.
They come to collect money almost every day. Yesterday and the day before they came. In the next few days, they will come again. But I will still have no money. How can we get out of poverty?
For now, it's one day of reprieve, facing an uncertain tomorrow. Lucita Saogao, CGTN, Thailand.
Now, as U.S. President Joe Biden moves forward with his COVID-19 relief package and executive orders, another challenging sector for him to handle will be big tech and its growing influence. Here's Mark New with the details.
During the final year of the Trump administration, tech executives were dragged before Congress on numerous occasions.
Neither the liberals nor the conservatives have a lot of love for the social media platforms, and they're about to be regulated.
At the center of debate is Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. The law protects internet platforms from being treated as the publishers or speakers of third-party content, except for violations involving criminal activity.
The companies themselves are open to some type of change.
Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook has said that we do need some form of regulation. At the same time, they do not want that particular law completely overturned because it puts them at a level of liability that is going to be almost impossible for them to monitor and manage.
During the final months of the Trump administration, in separate lawsuits, the U.S. government and dozens of states sued both Facebook and Google for monopolistic behavior. But it could take years and even decades to take on big tech and their big money.
If you add all the money that's spent by those companies, you're going to hit about $50 million, for all the big companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, you name it. Just to put this one in perspective, Facebook is one of the top lobbyist tech firms, in Washington, D.C., and they're spending money in a way to protect their business model.
Banaf also points out another strategic way tech companies are reaching out to the new administration: goodwill. Amazon offered to leverage its tech and operations to assist in the Biden administration's vaccine distribution. And Google just announced it will open up some of its facilities to serve as vaccination sites.
That's their way to say that, we are really opening our doors to be part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Another problematic issue on the agenda: frosty tech relations with China.
I'm not going to put it in the stuff that I'm responsible for.
That's the Trump administration's cyber information security officer last year telling a Huawei executive why they banned Huawei products. Bans on Chinese-owned apps, TikTok and WeChat soon followed, leaving all these thorny issues for the Biden administration to resolve. Security analyst Craig Spiesel moderated this cybersecurity event.
Whether we like it or not, China is a very strong economic player in the global economy, and a lot of U.S. products companies depend upon, and the supply chains. I would anticipate that President Biden will be looking at these issues at a much more pragmatic, fact-based decisions versus what appear to be emotional responses.
On Monday, when asked about Huawei, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said President Biden is firmly committed to making sure Chinese companies cannot misappropriate and misuse American data. When asked about TikTok, she had no information to share, adding she would look to get more. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
And shifting focus now, here's a look at commodity markets today. Oil prices edging up just slightly as demand concerns caused by new coronavirus variants and slow vaccine rollouts offset a cut in Saudi Arabian oil supply and, of course, falling U.S. oil inventories. Now, traders say right now prices are not falling or rising to any significant extent, and that's because restrictions on the demand side due to lockdowns are countered by a sufficient reduction in supply. Meanwhile, gold prices were steady today as investors waited for developments around a U.S. stimulus package. The metal was still on course to post a weekly and monthly decline. It was hurt by a stronger dollar. Global demand for gold fell to its lowest in 11 years in 2020. Well, let's take a short break now, still coming up on the show. We take a look at how the coronavirus pandemic is fueling personal debt and the risky borrowing trends in Kenya and South Africa.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
I've been Djibouti, Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys
The greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, the economic consequences of COVID-19 have financially crippled households across the continent. Many people have been forced to start the year by seeking loans. In today's episode of Panorama Africa, CGTN's Lindy Mtongana takes a look at rising personal debt and the risky borrowing trends emerging in Kenya and South Africa.
The first month of the year is jokingly called January in South Africa and in January in Kenya, referring to the hunger associated with being broke. But it's hardly a laughing matter. In many cases, the beginning of the year marks the start of a vicious cycle of debt. Nairobi-based debt and money management coach Roy Okonji sees similar patterns at the start of every year.
January is like a consequence of December, so to speak. What happens is that very many people have not nurtured the discipline, the financial discipline needed to handle December just like any other month. And therefore, they tend at that time to forget that January is coming.
A quick drive out of Nairobi, we meet Consolata Bahati Zena, an actress, singer and producer for local TV stations. In 2020, the coronavirus pandemic shut down the creative industry, forcing Bahati to find another way to sustain her family. Together with her husband, she now offers training in music and video production.
All my programs which are being aired on KTN, they all stopped at once, so I had to come up with this idea. I thought I should just put a studio here, since in Uviru there is no studio. And also I thought of coming up with a tuition stroke internship.
But with only a few students, taking out a loan seemed like the next best option.
Because life was so tough and I needed money for my kids. You know, when they are at home, they eat a lot.
Schools have since reopened and parents, including Bahati, are turning to mobile lenders to keep their children in school.
So I borrowed yesterday and I had to, because of my kid. I didn't want her to lack peace while in school, and she's completing her course Form 4. So I had to do that.
And while business is slow, Consolata hopes to be able to pay back the loan.
Apply loan. I believe I will pay. I can't promise because time is tough. Life is tough nowadays, but I just have faith I will pay it.
Since the launch of the mobile banking service M-Pesa in 2007, Kenya has witnessed a boom in digital lending, enabled by the widespread use of mobile phones and few regulatory barriers. Just a quick search on an app store reveals well over 60 options for digital lenders, all of whom offer quick and convenient loans.
Fintech, or the financial technology that has come in Kenya, that is increasing a lot, or a lot of apps have come up where people can easily borrow. And actually most of the microfinance or even Shylocks are also moving to apps because it's easier, and they can also be able to sell to a big clientele, or they can be able to reach out to a wider clientele.
We're trying to fight against some of the obstacles that consumers usually face. That means things like needing to go to physical location to request credit, the need to provide collateral in order to access that credit, the time wasted between applying for the credit and receiving it or not receiving it, and other forms of prejudice.
Dear customer, did you know that you can grow your loan limit every
But there are downsides, like incessant mobile marketing, encouraging one to borrow more, and interest rates as high as 45% a month.
30 days and watch your loan limit grow. They encourage you to take loans. When you, you take long to apply for their loans, they think that they have lost their customers. So, that's just encouraging us to apply for more and more loans.
People get to a point where they begin to look at them as saviors without caring and thinking about the end effect of the same. Because the truth is that they are very costly compared to mainstream loans. They are very costly and they come with a lot of pressure at the time of payment.
The questionable practices of some mobile lenders are not only associated with getting more people to borrow increasingly larger amounts of money, but also with ensuring those borrowers pay that money back. Some loan apps have been known to gather the personal data of their customers and then use that information to bully and shame them in the event of defaulting.
We have seen some organizations, as you said, during the loan collection process, essentially sending out messages to borrowers' entire phone book, trying to make their friends and family debt collectors. We as Tala and other members of the Digital Lenders Association in Kenya, we strongly are against and criticize such moves.
Despite the condemnation, mobile lenders do not need even so much as a license to operate. Anyone can start a lending app with just about whatever interest rates or terms and conditions they choose.
So the truth of the matter is, at least here in Kenya, currently, I'd say the sector is not externally regulated. We're a lot closer to self-regulation. So that's why we're currently in discussions with legislators and regulators in Kenya on creating more formal regulation that will seek to improve consumer protection without necessarily killing the nascent industry.
It may be some time before regulators and policymakers catch up with trends in the digital lending space. Until then, best be careful who you borrow from. Let's take a look at the situation in South Africa now. Long before the country reported its first cases of the coronavirus, there were already concerns about the unsustainable borrowing culture of the country's middle class. With net income falling by around 20%, many high and middle-class South Africans have been resorting to unsecured loans.
So personal loans have increased a lot, as well as payday loans and also credit cards, whereby, as I'm speaking to you right now, most of the credit cards, they have already reached their maximum, so they cannot even be able to access them anymore.
South Africans are among the most indebted individuals on the continent, with 26.9 million people owing over $130 billion. A closer look at these figures reveals a worrying scenario. 42% of credit-active consumers are struggling to pay their debt. South African consumers spend $6 of every 10 they earn on paying back loans. 12 million people have bad debt, meaning they've missed 3 or 4 monthly repayments. Those with bad debt have an average of 6 loans each. The COVID-19 pandemic has only made matters worse. South Africans have faced some of the world's toughest lockdown restrictions. The effect on the economy has been devastating. Pay cuts, job losses, and business closures have left the pockets of millions empty.
Consumers are borrowing in order for them to survive, not just to buy luxury things, just to survive, because most of them have lost employment, or maybe one household member is no longer working. Now they are relying on one income.
With infections on the rise, it's clear that this pandemic will continue to shape borrowing trends in South Africa and Kenya in 2021.
2021, it's not going to be easy. 2021 is also going to be difficult, because if the pandemic is still there, if you're not working, or maybe if your income has been cut, it's going to be very, very difficult for consumers to be where they are. It's going to take them time. It's going to take them months or years to be able to go back to where they have been before.
As much as they anticipated growth this year, but that is going to take time because before an economic turnaround happens, that is going to take more than 6 months. So meaning that the purchasing power of a common Kenyan is still going to be very low, and people are still going to borrow.
From every borrower's perspective, the reason for borrowing is always good because to them, at the point of borrowing, they're pressed. So borrowing looks like a solution. But then we have to differentiate good and bad debt from an impact perspective. Good debt is that debt that leaves you better than it found you in the long run.
The full effect of COVID-19 on Africa's economies remains to be seen. But what is clear is that Africans will continue interacting with lenders, and debts may indeed pile up during this year. But it would be wise to heed the advice of the experts. If you must borrow, do so wisely.
Well, let's go to Zimbabwe now. The country has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of restrictions to curb the spread of the disease, the government restricted movement except for the essential services sector. Now, while agriculture falls within this category, sector players have faced challenges in getting their fresh produce to consumers. CGTN's Alexandria Majala has more.
Transporting fresh produce across great distances can compromise the quality of the product by the time it gets to its destination. Clive Nyapokoto founded Shift Technologies to tackle this challenge.
The systems that we have, they are integrated. It's like they are connected to each other. It's an interchain, I can say. So it's from aquaponics, we are saying we are growing vegetables, utilizing fish waste. Unlike where we are saying someone is growing in a soil-based system where is just growing vegetables. Here we are saying fish as well as vegetables. So apart from consuming the vegetables, you're also getting your protein whereby you will be now eating the fish.
Vermi aquaponics is a soil-less growing technique that combines hydroponics with vermiculture. On Nyapokoto's small farm, his cycle consists of worms, fish and plants, all coexisting and feeding into each other.
If you look right now, maybe in relation to COVID-19, garbage collection or waste collection is not that much frequent, and hence you have to see how best you can manage waste within your household. So everything that is biodegradable, that can decompose, we give it to the worms or to the maggots. Then we get production of maggots, which we later on use to feed our fish.
For this Zimbabwean startup, sustainability in meeting the fresh produce demands in this time of COVID-19 does not necessarily mean huge farming land and expensive inputs. It means maximizing on that which is already available. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
And before we leave you today, here's a quick look at Africa's currencies. South Africa's rand weakening today. It is on track for a monthly drop as jitters over rising coronavirus cases globally, as well as a slow rollout of vaccines and the concerning slowdown in the pace of the domestic economic recovery has dented risk sentiment. Meanwhile, Nigeria's naira depreciated at the importer-exporter window. It closed at around 394 naira per dollar. It remained pretty stable at the black market, trading at around 478 naira per dollar. Now, of course, the country is facing demand pressures and forex shortages as dollar supply declines further by 27%. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.